Imagine a nation on the brink of collapse, not because of a foreign enemy, not because of invading armies, but because of the fragile tensions within its own borders. Picture a government shaken to its core, a president prepared to take up arms against his own citizens, and a state determined to defy the authority of the federal law. This was America in 1832, a young country, still finding its identity, still testing the limits of its constitution. It was a time when words could ignite war, and pride could topple the delicate balance that held the nation together. This was a nullification crisis, the moment America almost tore itself apart. The story begins in South Carolina, a state fiercely proud of its traditions, its economy rooted in cotton, rice, and slavery, and its belief in the sovereignty of the state. South Carolina's leaders argued that the federal government had grown too powerful, that tariffs designed to protect northern industry were strangling southern trade. They claimed the Constitution gave them the right to nullify federal laws within their borders, to declare them void and unenforceable. To outsiders, this seemed extreme. To the people of South Carolina, it was a moral imperative. Their economy, their society, their very way of life, they believed, was under threat. At the same time, the nation had a president who would not back down. Andrew Jackson, a man of iron will and fiery temper, had fought wars, survived assassination attempts, and risen from humble beginnings to lead the most powerful office in the land. Jackson saw nullification as a direct threat to the Union, a dangerous precedent that could unravel the fragile fabric of the nation. To him, a state could not pick and choose which laws to obey. If South Carolina succeeded, every state might follow. The Union itself would become a voluntary alliance of states, held together only by sentiment rather than law. For Jackson, this was unacceptable. He vowed to defend the Constitution, even if it meant sending troops to enforce it. The crisis was fueled by economic realities, but it was also a battle of ideas. South Carolina's Vice President, John C. Calhoun, had been one of Jackson's closest allies. Now he became the intellectual champion of nullification, arguing that the states had the right to check federal power and protect their own interests. He believed that the Constitution was a compact between sovereign states, and that a state could legally resist a law it deemed unconstitutional. Calhoun's arguments were persuasive, elegant, and dangerous. They gave legitimacy to defiance and planted the seeds of disunion that would grow over the next 3 decades. Tension escalated quickly. In Charleston, militia units trained quietly, preparing for the possibility of confrontation. In Washington, Jackson drafted the force bill, authorizing him to use military power to enforce federal law. The nation watched, holding its breath. Newspapers from New York to New Orleans printed fiery editorials. Families debated the crisis at dinner tables. Merchants worried about trade disruption. Farmers feared violence. The question on everyone's mind was simple but terrifying. Could the Union survive if a state openly defied federal authority? The crisis reached its peak during the Jefferson Day dinner of 1830. Jackson stood to give a toast, declaring with unmatched fury, "Our Union must be preserved." Gasps filled the room. Calhoun, his former friend and vice president, stood in icy response. "The Union next to our liberty, most dear." The room froze. Two visions of America, two men who had once walked side by side, now stood on opposite sides of a moral and political battlefield. It was not just a disagreement over policy. It was a clash of principles that would define the nation's future. As the federal government prepared for possible military action, a third man entered the story. Henry Clay, known as the Great Compromiser. Clay understood the stakes better than most. A war between the state and the federal government could destroy the country. He worked tirelessly to craft a compromise, a gradual reduction of tariffs that would allow South Carolina to save face while upholding the authority of the federal government. Clay's diplomacy became the crucial lever that prevented bloodshed and preserved a fragile Union. The compromise worked. South Carolina repealed its nullification of the tariff. Jackson withdrew his threat of military enforcement. For the moment, the nation exhaled. But the crisis had left deep scars. The ideas Calhoun championed did not disappear. The fear, pride, and ideological divisions planted by the nullification crisis would linger, shaping debates about states' rights, federal power, and ultimately slavery for decades to come. Historians would later point to this moment as the first serious test of the Union, a warning of the civil conflict that awaited in 1861. Yet the nullification crisis was not merely political. It was deeply human. Behind the speeches and legislation were ordinary Americans grappling with uncertainty and fear. Farmers in South Carolina worried that war might sweep across their fields. Enslaved people, already trapped in a system of brutal oppression, sensed danger in the rising militias and rhetoric. Northern merchants feared economic collapse if Southern ports were closed. The crisis reminded everyone that politics has consequences far beyond the halls of government, that decisions made by a few men in power can ripple across the lives of millions. The story of the nullification crisis is also a story about leadership and character. Jackson's unyielding defense of the Union, Calhoun's steadfast advocacy for states' rights, and Clay's tireless pursuit of compromise reveal how personal ambition, ideology, and courage can converge at a moment of national peril. These men were flawed, driven, and human, yet their choices shaped the fate of a nation. Without Jackson's resolve, the Union might have fractured. Without Clay's diplomacy, the crisis might have erupted into violence. Without Calhoun's vision, the South's grievances might never have coalesced into the ideas that would later justify secession. And it is this combination, the personal, the political, and the philosophical, that makes the nullification crisis so compelling. It is a story not just of law and policy, but of identity, pride, and the fragile bonds that hold a nation together. It is a story about what happens when disagreements escalate, when fear becomes courage, when principle clashes with power, and when the question of who decides becomes a question of survival. As America moved forward, expanding westward and confronting new challenges, the legacy of the nullification crisis remained. It shaped the debates over slavery, state sovereignty, and federal authority. It provided a blueprint for resistance, a warning of what could happen when pride and principle collide. It reminded the nation in no uncertain terms that the American experiment was fragile, that democracy is not inevitable, and that unity requires constant vigilance, courage, and compromise. And so the story of the nullification crisis is not merely a historical footnote. It is a living lesson. It reminds us that the survival of a nation depends on the delicate balance of power, the strength of leadership, and the willingness of people to listen, negotiate, and sometimes yield. It is a reminder that even in a country built on laws and ideals, human passion can bring it to the brink of destruction.